started here on the tractor parade. First up, we have Billy Doyle from Cynthiana, Kentucky on a 1971 656 International. And riding along with him is Katie up on the fender. Thank you, Billy. Appreciate that. Next up, we have Sharon and Anna Marsh from Cynthiana, Kentucky on a Farmall 130, a 1957. Next up, we have John Ragg from Foster, Kentucky on a Massey Harris 44-6. Next up, we have Jason Baker from Alex, Kentucky on a 1947 John Deere B. Next up, we have Isaac Daly on a Case D. That's a 1949 Case D. Next in line, we have Johnny Stewart from Worthville, Kentucky on a 185 Alice Chandler. That's a 1980 185 Alice Chandler. What's the number on this next one? What's your number? All right. Here we have up Randall and Debbie Miles from Sanders, Kentucky on a 1945 Centaur KM. Next up we have Heath Hewitt from Sanders, Kentucky on a 1942 Farmall H. Next up we have Jerry Pombles from Highland Heights, Kentucky in a 1929 AA Ford Beetle Dog. How about that, ladies and gentlemen? Yeah. Coming up next, we have Harmon Baker from Lexington, Kentucky. Harmon Barker from Lexington, Kentucky on a 1944 AM VTS. How about that? Minneapolis Moline there. Next up, we have double steered Debbie and Tom Florence here as a 1967 Farmall 1946 Farmall B. Next up we have Richard Bailey and Isaac, that's not Isaac, and Frazier on a Chore Master. How about that? We have Harold Miles from Brooksville, Kentucky with an International 782. International 782. Next up we have a tractor on Madonna King. Wait a minute. This is not matching up here. Is this Jerome King? On a 1968 Ford 120. Next up we have a late 70 Aaron's SG10. Next up we have Ronald McLean on a Gibson. Next we have Mary Jane Bailey on a 1955 John Deere 40, all the way from Keller, Texas. Next up we have J.W. Verrier on a John Deere 70 standard diesel. Next up we have Tommy Florence on a 1953 WD 45 Alice Chalmers. Next up we have Jacqueline Rawlins on a 1954 John Deere 70D. Next up we have a tractor owned by Tom Florence on a 1967 656 Farmall. Next up we have Mary Pope on a 1957 Farmall 350. On a 1947 Massey Harris 20, we have R.J. Barrick, the featured tractor of this year's show, the Massey Harris. Next up, we have a 1946 Massey Harris, owned by Betty Daly. Little Bill, again, the featured tractor of this year's show. Next up, we have Dave Feltz from Cecilia, Kentucky, on an Alice Chandler 15-2, 1964 model, Series 2. Next up, we have Billy Milky from Berry, Kentucky. Billy Miley from Berry, Kentucky, 1949 Oliver 88 Standard. Next up we have Jordan Woodall on a 1950 Oliver 66. Next up we have Jason Florence on a 1959 Ford 891. If you were at last year's show, you got to see this tractor. He's done a lot of work to it since it was here last year. Thank you, Jason. Next up we have Zach Furman's Oliver Cleatrack, a 1949 model. Next up we have Braxton Furman on a John Deere B Mini, that's a 1937 series. Okay. Next we have Jason Marshall on a John Deere 80. Next up we have Tommy Ham of Cynthiana, Kentucky on a 901 Powermaster Ford. It's a 1960 model. Next up we have James Kinney from Cynthiana, Kentucky on a 1960 Ford 4000. Brandon Welty from Cynthiana, Kentucky on a 1952 Case BAC. After Brandon we have Dustin Green from Carrollton, Kentucky on a 1938 Farmall F14. We have David Allison on an 1175 Spirit of 76. Check that case out. Spirit of 76 here. Next up we have another one owned by David Allison. It's a 730 case. 1968.